quick question, Tanya. What type of legal cases are brought against business brokers usually that you have seen or John may have seen?
Typically what I've seen is that particularly with smaller businesses, so the smaller the transaction, the higher the probability there's going to be an issue. And again, that's because when you have a small business, let's say it's $150,000, you have a buyer who oftentimes they're a first-time buyer. They've never bought a business before. Oftentimes they've never owned a business before. They don't want to pay an accountant to help them with due diligence. They don't want to pay an attorney to help them with due diligence. And so they look to the broker and to themselves, because they've never owned a business, they really don't know what they're looking for. So they end up looking to the broker really for most of their due diligence, which obviously is not our job. And even though we have disclaimers and waivers and everything else in the documents, if the buyer ends up burning the business to the ground, then they will find an attorney and turn around and sue the seller for fraud and claim that there were all kinds of things that were never disclosed. And then, just as a matter of course, most attorneys will go ahead and include in the lawsuit everybody who touched the deal. So they will try to bring in, they'll typically sue the business broker. They may or may not. They usually leave escrow companies alone. I'm not sure why, but they'll leave escrow out of it. But they'll usually include the broker. And so, even if you did absolutely nothing wrong, it can be very, very expensive to defend a lawsuit, which is one of the reasons why eXp Realty won't allow. They don't have E&O that'll cover it. eXp Commercial, we do have errors and omissions coverage for business. So, and that's also why eXp Commercial requires all the business brokers to join the IBBA and to get educated and take courses, because it helps to keep the E&O premiums down. Because if you don't have any of those requirements, E&O coverage for business brokerage is actually very high. It's very expensive.
Thank you. And just,
so yeah, it's usually misrepresentation, fraud charges, non-disclosure, concealment. So everything that because fraud comes in a lot of varieties. So you have intentional misrepresentation, negligent misrepresentation. You have intentional, then you have concealment, meaning that you hid things that you had knowledge of, right? That would have materially affected the transaction.
Would you recommend that a broker have their legal person draft something just to cover the broker so that this buyer or even seller doesn't have a strong case against the broker? What would those things you mentioned? What would
I mean, the forms already have that. The representation agreement already has language in there that the seller will indemnify the broker. There's language in the asset purchase agreements that we use where buyer and seller are both agreeing to look to each other if there are any issues, and that they're both agreeing that the broker is not creating any of the information. They're just passing, buyers agreeing that the broker is just passing information that it obtained from the seller. So there's a lot of language that's already in there, but the thing is, anybody can sue anybody for anything. And so once you're sued, you have to defend it. So a lawsuit in California costs $435 to file a lawsuit. And then, the person has to defend. So I would say, Nasser, that, I mean, we're lucky within eXp Commercial. It's like, hey, if somebody sues us, then first of all, they're going to sue the broker. They might serve us personally, but also the broker. And then eXp has legal counsel. that would handle it. And they have E&O insurance. The insurance companies has legal counsel that would handle it. So, you know, if there's ever an issue, you need to make sure that you get a hold of the state broker and let them know immediately so that they can get the insurance company involved.
So is the legal department at EXP, they're available to brokers to ask questions or consult?
No.
No.
Yeah, if you have questions, then you go to your state broker, typically.
I've always, because I also run a wealth management practice, and we have that concern dealing with estate planning. People think we're lawyers because a lot of our conversation gets into title and who owns what. And make it a point to always include telling them several times throughout the conversation, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a CPA.
Yeah.
Tell them how little, I tell them how little I know about accounting. I just know enough to read the reports that the real accountants put together. And then they also sign forms that show that I'm not, that say that I'm not an attorney or a CPA. And then I also make the instructions. You need to go find yourself a CPA or an attorney that will help review this information so that everything goes together and we don't have any problems down the line.
Right.
That's my.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, you can certainly send something to the buyer that says, hey, can you provide the name of your CPA and the name of your attorney? And, you know, a lot of times they just won't, if they're not going to be hiring a CPA or an attorney. And again, that's on the smaller deals. And that's why, you know, if you're working with a company that's got a business that's going to be selling for $1 or $2 million, the odds are they have a CPA, they have an attorney, they're accustomed to working with professionals. So it's much easier for us to work with them because they understand, you know, they understand how to deal with professionals. But when you're dealing with, you know, smaller Main Street businesses, liquor stores, dry cleaners, hair salons, things like that, you know, your Main Street stuff, sometimes, you know, their relationship with their CPA is to have their taxes done once a year. And other than that, they never talk to them. They probably don't have an attorney. And so they don't, oftentimes they look at all of that as an expense and they don't want to incur those kind of expenses. On the seller side, it's not, you know, as critical, but on the buyer side, it certainly is because your buyer needs to understand what they're buying. They need to have an attorney and a CPA vet that business and make sure that the financials make sense. You know, certainly we can do that to some extent, but it's not our job and we don't want to represent that it is. So, you know, we're going to ask questions. We're going to look at the financials. We're going to ask questions to draw out information from the seller. But ultimately the buyer needs to do their own due diligence with their own team of professionals. So, you know, an email that says, who's on your team? You know, who's your CPA? Who's your team? Who's your advisory team for this transaction? You know, you've asked the question. And also if they don't know, you know, it's always good to have relationships. So you may want to have 3 or 4 attorneys and 3 or 4 CPAs that, you know, would work well with different buyers that you can refer them to. And that way you can just send them a list, send a buyer and say, hey, if you don't have an advisory team, here's a list of 3 or 4 attorneys and 3 or 4 CPAs that I know that would be able to help you with this transaction. And then, you know, you've got one more piece of documentation to help cover yourself where you've recommended to them, hey, they need to get their advisors in order. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you. Thank you, Tawnya.